Something happened in the Persian Gulf overnight that no amount of Iranian state media denial can walk back, no amount of official silence can conceal, and no previous moment in this conflict fully prepared the world to process. A guided missile destroyer turned into the wind, opened its vertical launch cells, and began firing. Not one Tomahawk, not a handful. 49 of them, one after another, arcing across the night sky toward radar sites, communication hubs, air defense batteries, and IRGC leadership headquarters spread across the entire country of Iran. Not just the coast, not just the strait, but deep into the Iranian interior. Kharg, Nazarabad, southeast of Tehran, Bandar Abbas, Keshm Island, the entire map of Iranian military infrastructure lit up in a single night by precision weapons that do not miss and do not negotiate. And then the announcement came, the one that changes everything, the one that the Iranian leadership has been dreading since this conflict began, and that the mainstream coverage has not yet fully processed in terms of what it actually means for the regime's survival. Not just strikes on Kharg Island, ownership of it, of control of it. The terminal that handles 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, the financial heart of the Islamic Republic, the mechanism through which $500 million flows into the mullah's accounts every single day, being taken by the United States of America and assumed under American control. Permanently, not temporarily, not as a bargaining chip, as a strategic acquisition. When you understand what Kharg Island actually is, you understand why that announcement is not just a military escalation. It is a declaration of the endgame. And the endgame has a shape now that it did not have before this night. But let's back all the way up, because to understand how a single night of Tomahawk launches and a presidential Truth Social post transformed the strategic architecture of this entire conflict, you need to understand the sequence of events that made it inevitable, and why the Iranian regime's inability to come to the negotiating table with anything resembling a coherent, acceptable position is not a failure of diplomacy. It is the predictable institutional output of a command structure that has been running this playbook for 47 years, and that does not know how to run any other one. The trigger for this specific escalation was an Iranian drone striking a United States Army AH-64 Apache helicopter over the Strait of Hormuz. The Apache went down. Both crew members were pulled from the water, rescued not by a conventional naval vessel, but by an autonomous sea drone developed by an Austin-based company, which deployed to the crash site and extracted the aviators while they were floating in the Persian Gulf. Both crew members survived, recovered uninjured. The Shahed drone that hit the Apache apparently did not detonate on impact, which is the only reason those two pilots are alive rather than dead at the bottom of the strait. One failure of an Iranian explosive mechanism is the difference between a dramatic incident and a national catastrophe for the American families of those aviators. One detonation failure. Washington called it what it was: a brutal attack on American forces. Tehran called it false pretext, as Tehran calls every Iranian military action that produces an American response. But the clock started regardless of what Tehran called it. And what the clock started was a 2-night, and counting, precision strike campaign that has now walked American precision weapons across the entire Iranian map in a way that no previous phase of this conflict had done. Night 1 was the opening statement. Air Force and Navy fighters delivering precision munitions into Iranian air defense batteries, ground control stations, and surveillance radar sites ringing the Strait of Hormuz and extending across the country. Explosions heard across enormous geographic areas of Iran as the strike packages executed their sequences. CENTCOM's description of the operation was careful and precise. A proportional response to recent attacks on U.S. forces and international commercial ships transiting regional waters. Proportional. Targeted. Methodical. Night 1 was the calibrated opening of a campaign that was always designed to escalate. The Iranian response to Night 1 followed the institutional script that the IRGC has been running without variation throughout this conflict. Claims of striking 18 American targets across Ali al-Salem and Ahmad al-Jaber in Kuwait, and Sheikh Isa Air Base in Bahrain. Drones sent into the 5th Fleet's anchorage in Bahrain. A long-range missile fired at Azraq Air Base in Jordan, one of the most strategically important bases in the American regional posture because it houses F-35s. The IRGC claimed it struck an F-35, either the aircraft itself or its hangar. Reports were spotty, unconfirmed, coming out of Iranian sources whose institutional incentive is to claim success regardless of operational reality. But the launches were real. The missiles were real. The institutional determination to respond with everything available was real. Here is the most important analytical data point in the entire Iranian response picture, and it is the one that tells you more about where this conflict is headed than any individual strike or any individual Iranian claim. The IRGC's ballistic missile stockpiles are down approximately 90% from pre-conflict levels. 90%. The institution that built its entire deterrent posture, its entire regional influence architecture, its entire negotiating leverage around the possession of thousands of ballistic missiles capable of reaching targets across the Middle East, is now operating with a fraction of that inventory, launching salvos of 10 or so at a time, waiting multiple days between launches, rationing the last vestiges of a strategic weapons program that the American campaign has been systematically eliminating across every phase of this conflict. What you are watching when you see the IRGC launch 10 missiles at Bahrain and then wait 3 days before launching again is not tactical patience. It is inventory management at the edge of depletion. An institution that once launched hundreds of missiles in a single coordinated salvo, the kind of overwhelming mass launch that saturates even sophisticated air defense networks, is now carefully counting what it has left and deciding which targets justify spending the remaining inventory against. That is not the behavior of a military force executing a confident strategic campaign. That is the behavior of a military force that knows its most consequential weapons are almost gone and cannot be replaced, because the production infrastructure, the resupply corridors, and the aerial import pathways are all being closed simultaneously. Night 2 intensified, more strike packages, more Iranian air defense architecture being systematically dismantled, more IRGC command and control infrastructure going dark. And then the Secretary of Defense issued the statement that functioned as the movie trailer for what was coming next. We will be busy tonight. 3 words that told everyone who understood the operational context of this conflict everything they needed to know about the scale of what was being prepared for Night 3. The largest strike package yet. The one that the American military had been building toward since the ceasefire ended and the full war footing was reestablished. Now, let's talk about what 49 Tomahawk missiles actually represent as an operational instrument in this context, because the number matters beyond its dramatic visual impact. A Tomahawk cruise missile is not a dumb bomb. It is a precision-guided, terrain-following, GPS-updated weapon system capable of navigating hundreds of miles at low altitude to deliver its warhead to within meters of a designated target coordinate. It can be reprogrammed in flight, it can navigate around obstacles, it can be targeted against specific elements of a complex structure, a communications tower on a specific building, a radar emitter on a specific installation, a fuel storage tank at a specific distance from civilian infrastructure, with the kind of accuracy that distinguishes precision warfare from the blunt force bombardment that characterized earlier eras of military conflict. 49 of them fired from a single destroyer in a single night means 49 simultaneously arriving precision effects distributed across the full geographic depth of Iranian territory, each one addressing a specific element of the IRGC's military infrastructure, each one selected because the targeting intelligence identified it as part of a specific capability the IRGC was using to threaten American forces, partner nations, or commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. And the Tomahawks were not alone. The F-16CJ Wild Weasel was in the air, the platform whose entire operational purpose is to suppress Iranian air defense systems by hunting their radar emitters with AGM-88 HARM missiles that home on the radar emissions themselves. The moment an Iranian radar operator activates his system to search for the incoming threat, he paints a targeting solution onto his own forehead. The harm follows the emission to its source. The suppression layer was running simultaneously with the Tomahawk salvos, ensuring that whatever Iranian air defense capability might otherwise have engaged the incoming cruise missiles found itself under direct attack the moment it tried to do so. Behind the Wild Weasels came the freight trains, the F-15E Strike Eagles, the platform capable of carrying the heaviest precision ordnance in the American tactical aviation inventory, including bunker-busting bombs specifically designed to reach targets buried underground. GBU-54's 2,000-pound joint direct attack munitions. The works. The F-15E is the door kicker of the American air campaign, the platform that arrives after the suppression layer has cleared the air defense environment and delivers the ordnance that destroys the hardened targets that survived the opening suppression sequence. And above all of it, F-35s tracking the Iranian response in real time, watching what the IRGC was doing in reaction to the strikes, feeding that intelligence picture into the targeting cells for the next sequence. F-18 Super Hornets launching off carrier decks in the Arabian Sea. The full multi-platform, multi-domain, layered precision strike architecture of the United States military, executing simultaneously at a scale that no regional adversary has faced in the modern era of precision warfare. Every platform doing the specific job it was designed to do, in the specific sequence that maximizes overall effectiveness, coordinated across hundreds of miles of operational airspace with the E-3B Sentry overhead, sending the signals that keep every element of the package synchronized. Now let's address the most consequential sentence that has been uttered in this entire conflict. The announcement that Kharg Island would be taken, assumed under total American control, along with other oil infrastructure points, managing Iran's oil and gas markets much like the United States has done with Venezuela. That sentence is not a military escalation in the conventional sense. It is a declaration of a new strategic objective that transforms the entire purpose of the American campaign and the entire economic architecture of the conflict's potential resolution. Every previous strike in this campaign, however devastating, however comprehensive in its destruction of Iranian military infrastructure, has been framed in the operational language of maritime security enforcement. Degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, protecting innocent civilian mariners, keeping the international waterway open for global commerce. Those are the stated justifications. They are also accurate descriptions of what the military campaign has been doing. But taking Kharg Island and assuming control of Iranian oil and gas markets is a different category of objective entirely. It is not degradation. It is acquisition. It is the United States military establishing operational control over the economic infrastructure of a sovereign state. Not to destroy it, but to own it. To direct its output. To determine where the revenue flows and who receives it. To take from the hands of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps the $500 million per day that Kharg Island generates and redirect that revenue in ways that Washington, rather than Tehran, determines. The comparison to Venezuela is analytically instructive. The United States has established mechanisms of oversight, sanction enforcement, and revenue control over Venezuelan oil production that have fundamentally altered the economic relationship between this Venezuelan state and its own primary revenue source. The announcement about Kharg Island is saying the same framework will be applied to Iran, that the terminal handling 90% of Iranian crude exports will no longer be an asset of the Islamic Republic generating revenue for the IRGC. It will be an asset under American operational control generating revenue in directions that the American administration determines. For the IRGC's leadership, that announcement is not a military threat. It is an existential threat to the institutional infrastructure of the regime itself. Without Kharg Island's revenue, the IRGC cannot pay its personnel, cannot fund its proxy network from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq to Syria, cannot sustain its weapons programs, cannot maintain the patronage structure through which it has secured political loyalty within the Islamic Republic's institutional architecture for 4 decades, cannot do any of the things that make it the dominant power in the Iranian political system. The loss of Kharg Island's revenue is not a blow to the IRGC's military capability. It is a blow to the IRGC's capacity to exist as a functional institution. And here's what makes that announcement so strategically devastating in terms of its psychological and diplomatic impact beyond the immediate military dimension. The IRGC has been operating throughout this conflict under the assumption that the American campaign would eventually stop, that diplomatic, economic, or political constraints would force a pause, a negotiation, a ceasefire that would allow the institution to reconstitute, rearm, and resume its campaign from a position that had been partially rebuilt during the pause. The ceasefire demonstrated that this assumption was not irrational. The ceasefire happened. The IRGC used it exactly as planned, digging out its missiles, repositioning its inventory, rebuilding what the first phase of American strikes had destroyed, and preparing to resume hostilities from an improved position. But you cannot reconstitute your way back from losing Kharg Island if Kharg Island is under American operational control. You cannot rebuild a revenue stream that is no longer flowing to you. You cannot wait out a campaign that has taken your money and is holding it permanently. The ceasefire reconstitution strategy requires that the underlying economic infrastructure of the regime remain intact enough to fund the reconstitution. Kharg Island, under American control, removes that underlying infrastructure from the equation in a way that no military strike campaign, however comprehensive, achieves by itself. Destroying weapons eliminates current inventory. Owning Kharg eliminates the financial mechanism that buys the next inventory. Now, let's go inside the Iranian strategic position and understand what the IRGC actually wants. Because understanding the actual objective clarifies why negotiation has been impossible and why the current trajectory was always more likely than any managed diplomatic resolution. The IRGC is not fighting this war to control the Strait of Hormuz for its own sake. The strait is leverage, the mechanism through which the institution generates bargaining power against a United States that has enough economic and political stake in Gulf energy security to be compelled to negotiate under certain conditions. The underlying objective is institutional survival through nuclear weapons capability. The IRGC's entire long-term strategic plan rests on a sequence. Use the strait as leverage to force American withdrawal from the region. Use the diplomatic breathing room created by that withdrawal to complete the nuclear weapons development program. Emerge with a nuclear deterrent that makes direct military action against the Islamic Republic prohibitively costly for any external actor. And then govern Iran indefinitely from behind the protection of that deterrent. That is why the demands the IRGC has made in every negotiating interaction in this conflict are structurally unacceptable to any American administration. Full war reparations, American withdrawal from the entire region, unrestricted right to develop a nuclear program. These are not negotiating positions that function as opening bids in a diplomatic process where both sides make concessions and arrive at a compromise. They are statements of the IRGC's actual minimum requirements for a settlement that preserves its institutional position, and those minimum requirements are incompatible with any American strategic interest in the region, any Gulf Arab partner nation's security, any Israeli government's survival calculus, and any international non-proliferation framework that has ever existed. The Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi, the President Pezeshkian, the diplomats who show up to Doha meetings and sometimes deny they are there at the same time their own president is announcing the meeting from the Oval Office, these are the westward-facing representatives of a regime whose actual decision-making authority lies with the IRGC. They cannot make a deal without IRGC approval, and the IRGC will not approve any deal that does not preserve its nuclear program, its regional proxy network, and its dominant position in the Islamic Republic's internal power structure. None of those conditions are compatible with the terms the American military campaign is forcing toward. So the negotiations have been theater, not cynically theater. The diplomats involved are genuinely attempting to find a framework that both sides can accept, but structurally theater because the institution that actually holds decision-making authority in Tehran has objectives that cannot be satisfied by any agreement the United States can sign while maintaining its own strategic commitments in the region. The IRGC wants to win. Winning for the IRGC means preserving the regime in a form that can eventually acquire nuclear weapons. The United States has made clear, through Trump's public statement that Iran will never have a nuke, that this is the one outcome it will not accept under any circumstances. These positions are not bridgeable by creative diplomatic language. They are structurally incompatible. And that structural incompatibility is what explains the American decision to move from degrading Iranian military capability to taking Iranian economic infrastructure. If the IRGC cannot be negotiated with toward an acceptable outcome, the alternative is removing its capacity to sustain the conflict, not by destroying its weapons faster than it can replace them, but by eliminating the financial mechanism that funds the entire enterprise. Now, let's talk about the tactical problem the American military has been solving across these consecutive nights of strikes, because the operational challenge of running precision strike campaigns against an adversary that has spent the ceasefire burying everything underground is more complex than the headline strike tallies convey. Iran's reconstitution strategy during the ceasefire was systematic and deliberate. The IRGC knew from the first phase of American strikes exactly which categories of asset were most vulnerable to aerial attack: fixed installations, surface-deployed radar systems, coastal naval facilities, above-ground missile storage. It spent the ceasefire moving everything it could underground, burying missile stockpiles in hardened underground storage facilities, repositioning mobile launchers to underground shelters in the eastern mountain regions, where the coastal-focused first phase of strikes had not reached, hardening communications infrastructure, building new sites, including 2 that CENTCOM found and struck before their concrete had fully cured because American surveillance capability found them at the moment of their completion. Everything that still has functional military value in the IRGC's remaining inventory is underground. That changes the targeting problem in a specific and technically important way. Striking a surface-deployed radar site requires 1 precision munition with the right guidance package. Striking an underground hardened facility requires bunker-busting weapons, specifically the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator for the deepest targets, or the family of bunker-busting variants carried by F-15E Strike Eagles for more moderate hardening. The CAD layer still goes first to clear the air defense environment, but the follow-on strike package is configured differently. Heavier ordnance, more specifically sequenced to address underground target geometries, more reliant on the intelligence picture that Force Recon and ISR platforms have been building of where exactly the underground facilities are located and how they are configured. This is the operational environment that Night 3's strike package was being built for, not the targets that were visible and easy to reach in the first phase, the targets that the IRGC believed it had protected by putting them underground during the ceasefire. The American military spent the ceasefire doing the same thing the IRGC was doing, not reconstituting weapons, but building the intelligence picture of where the IRGC had moved everything, so that when the campaign resumed, the targeting packages would be aimed at the new positions rather than the old ones. CENTCOM found both newly built sites before their concrete cured. That is not surveillance. That is a persistent, comprehensive, real-time intelligence collection capability that sees Iranian military infrastructure being constructed at the moment of its construction and adds it to the targeting list before it becomes operationally functional. The IRGC cannot build anything. The American intelligence apparatus does not find. It cannot hide things by burying them when the sensors tracking it can see what is happening underground through a combination of seismic monitoring, thermal signature analysis, electromagnetic emissions tracking, and the human intelligence provided by ground-based operations that have been running throughout this conflict. Now, let's talk about the oil tanker dimension that has been running alongside the military campaign, and that provides an additional operational mechanism for the economic pressure track the American campaign is executing. The MT Gelvir took 2 Hellfire missiles to the engine room after the crew ignored repeated warnings from American naval forces enforcing the blockade. This is not the American military striking commercial shipping at random. It is the enforcement mechanism of the naval blockade, operating exactly as naval blockades have always operated. Warnings issued, compliance demanded, and if compliance is refused, the vessel's ability to move is eliminated with precision munitions targeted specifically at the engine room to disable rather than sink. 2 Hellfires to the engine room. The ship stops. The blockade is enforced. The message to every other vessel considering a run at Iranian ports is delivered in the most unambiguous possible way. The combination of naval blockade enforcement, Kharg Island seizure, and the systematic elimination of every other Iranian revenue mechanism creates a financial encirclement that is comprehensive in a way that military strikes alone cannot achieve. Strikes destroy capability. Financial encirclement destroys the institution's reason for continuing to fight, because if the revenue that funds the fighting is gone, the institutional calculation about whether continued resistance produces any outcome worth the cost becomes impossible to make in favor of continued resistance. Now, let's analyze the 3-track convergence with the depth and specificity this moment demands, because the individual tracks of the American campaign do not produce their full effect in isolation. Their simultaneous convergence is what creates the strategic condition that the Iranian regime is now facing. The military track is at maximum operational intensity. 49 Tomahawks in a single night. The full-layered strike architecture of Wild Weasels, Strike Eagles, F-35s, and carrier-based F-18s executing simultaneously. Night 3 being the largest package yet. Bunker-busting ordnance being employed against the underground facilities the IRGC used the ceasefire to prepare. The Marine Expeditionary Unit positioned offshore with its ISR capability, its F-35Bs, its force recon operators, and its self-sustained 2-week combat capability ready to execute the Kharg Island ground operation. Iranian ballistic missile stockpiles at approximately 10% of pre-conflict levels, being rationed in salvos of 10 and launched with days between cycles as the institution manages the last vestiges of its strategic deterrent. The military track is not at a plateau. It is accelerating with each successive night of operations. The financial track has moved from pressure to potential elimination. $500 million per day flows through Kharg Island. If Kharg Island comes under American operational control, that flow stops going to the IRGC and goes somewhere else. The proxies in Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq that depend on Iranian financial support face funding interruption. The IRGC personnel who depend on institutional salary structures face payment disruption. The weapons programs that require procurement funding face budgetary collapse. The entire financial architecture of the Islamic Republic's military and political dominance rests on the oil revenue that Kharg Island generates. Taking Kharg is not striking the IRGC's wallet. It is taking the wallet entirely and putting it in an American pocket. The psychological track is operating on multiple audiences simultaneously with unprecedented intensity. The Iranian civilian population is experiencing rolling blackouts, economic encirclement, and the accumulating evidence that the government that promised them security and dignity is conducting a military campaign that is producing the opposite of both. The IRGC's own military personnel are fighting a campaign in which their ballistic missile inventory is 90% depleted. Their air defense has been stripped to irrelevance for manned aircraft. Their coastal military infrastructure has been systematically destroyed across months of operations, and their supreme commander's son is somewhere in the background of a regime that has publicly committed to objectives it cannot militarily achieve. The Iranian political establishment, the clerics, the technocrats, the institutional actors who support the regime requires to function, is watching the IRGC's institutional position weaken with every strike package that arrives, and every day that Kharg Island remains within operational range of a Marine Expeditionary Unit that does not need permission from anyone to take it. And, internationally, the announcement about taking Kharg and controlling Iranian oil markets has introduced a new actor into the strategic calculation: Europe. The United Kingdom specifically has historically benefited from a premium on Brent crude futures pricing that is tied to the volume flowing through the Gulf. If the United States assumes operational control of Iranian oil infrastructure, the pricing and distribution dynamics of Gulf energy shift in ways that give European energy consumers and European governments a direct stake in the outcome of the American campaign that previous phases of the conflict did not create. European partners who have been maintaining studied distance from the American military campaign may find their own economic interests aligning more closely with American strategic objectives as the implications of Kharg Island control work their way through the global energy market architecture. Here's the honest strategic assessment of where this conflict stands at this moment. The Islamic Republic of Iran is fighting a war it cannot win militarily, cannot sustain financially, and cannot negotiate its way out of because the institution that holds actual decision-making authority in Tehran, the IRGC, has objectives that are incompatible with any outcome the United States can accept. Its ballistic missile stockpile is at 10% of pre-conflict levels. Its coastal military infrastructure has been reduced from a comprehensive maritime coercion architecture to a collection of dispersed, degraded remnants scattered across a coastline that American aircraft operate over with complete impunity. Its underground reconstituted assets are being found and targeted by an American intelligence capability that located newly built sites before their concrete cured. Its financial infrastructure is facing potential seizure of the terminal through which 90% of its crude export revenue flows. And its only remaining strategic option, the nuclear weapons development program it has been protecting at all costs, has been publicly declared by the American president as something that will never be allowed to happen. The IRGC's strategic theory of this conflict has been to hold out long enough to force a negotiated outcome that preserves the regime in a form capable of eventually achieving nuclear weapons capability. The theory requires surviving the American military campaign long enough for political and economic pressures to force a pause. But with Kharg Island potentially going under American operational control, the financial mechanism that funds the holdout strategy is being removed. You cannot wait out a military campaign if you cannot afford to pay the people executing your side of it. The Apache went down in the Strait of Hormuz. Both crew members survived because an autonomous sea drone got to them first. 49 Tomahawks flew through the night toward targets spread across the entire Iranian map. Night 3 was announced as the largest strike package yet. And somewhere on the USS Tripoli, Marines who do not ask permission from anyone are looking at the intelligence picture that Force Recon has been building of Kharg Island's defenses, knowing that the presidential announcement about taking it was not a conditional statement. It was a schedule. The mullahs had a chance to come to the table with something that resembled common sense. They could not do it, because the institution that actually runs the Islamic Republic does not operate on common sense. It operates on ideology, on institutional survival, and on the assumption that it can outlast whatever pressure is applied to it. That assumption has sustained the IRGC through 47 years of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and limited military exchanges. It has never been tested against what is being applied to it right now, a simultaneous military, financial, and strategic dismantlement that is approaching the point where the institution being dismantled may not have the capacity to reconstitute from what remains when the current campaign reaches its conclusion. The IRGC is in its last death throes. The ballistic missiles are nearly gone. The coastal architecture is destroyed. The airports are being hit to close the aerial resupply. The ports are blockaded. The rail corridor is severed. The power plants are being struck. And Kharg Island, the financial heart, the $500 million daily pulse of the regime's institutional existence, has been publicly announced as the next acquisition of the United States of America. The Iranian air traffic control system is telling its people to disregard the Tomahawks as lightning strikes. The IRGC is claiming the Strait of Hormuz is closed while hundreds of vessels transit it. The deputy foreign minister is denying meetings that the American president is announcing from the Oval Office. And the USS Michael Murphy is reloading its vertical launch cells for whatever tonight brings. The entire Iranian air defense network, its navy, its radar systems, and most of its offensive capability are, in the words of the American commander-in-chief, gone. What remains is a regime firing its last ballistic missiles in rationed salvos of 10, burying what little it has left in underground facilities that American surveillance found at the moment of their construction, and preparing for the moment when it runs out of options that were already running out before tonight's strike package even begins. That moment is not approaching. It is here, and the Marines on the Tripoli are not watching it from a distance.